donations, as well as support from community individuals like you. So if you'd like to join our membership or give us a donation to help us with programs like this, you can check out the links in the chat. We also have a quarterly newsletter that will keep you up to date on the most recent happenings here at Mabry-Hazen House. So for future lectures and other programs, this is one of the best ways to keep up with us. You can sign up for that newsletter by clicking the link again in the chat. Finally, we are active on social media. So if you're on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, please follow us and share our posts, like them. The Facebook logarithms have changed up recently, so we've had a little bit of struggle trying to get our voice out there. So any help we can get there, we appreciate. Now this program, under Rebel rule, once again, the the Constitution, the Convention of 1870 and in the Tennessee's Reconstruction is also sponsored or partnered with the Historic Homes of Knoxville with the support from Civil War Trails. The Historic Homes of Knoxville is a group of historic houses here in the area, including James White Fort, Blunt Mansion, Ramsey House, Marble Springs, Crescent Bend, and Westwood. And we help tell Knoxville's story through the families and the houses here in the area. And this year, we're actually celebrating Tennessee's 225th anniversary. And we have actually partnered with the Historic Homes for a series of events showcasing the significant contributions Knoxville and Knoxvillians have made to Tennessee over those 2 centuries. It's also going to highlight the history of Knoxville from 1796 onward. Recently, Blunt Mansion premiered a new 40-minute film highlighting the signing of the first state constitution by William Blunt and 54 other founders on February 6, 1796. This video, which link you can see in the chat, is available on their YouTube, and it has interviews from Jack Neely, a local historian, as well as constitutional law scholar Stuart Harris, and a special message from Tennessee Governor Bill Lee. Blunt Mansion will also be hosting our kind of signature event this year on June 1st, 2021, on the very site where Tennessee Constitution was drafted, and they have the desk it was signed upon. They'll be having a parade as well as a number of other events on June 1st, 2021. So keep an eye on all of our websites, as well as TennesseeStatehood.com to see all of the upcoming events throughout this year. Now, without further ado, we'll get into our lecture this evening. So I am here with Dr. William Hardy. But before I do kind of hand things off to Dr. Hardy to talk about the Constitution, there is one person I'd like to bring in, and that is Joseph A. Mabry. Now, Mabry was actually a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1870. Actually, on November 28th, 1869, he wrote, "In responding to your solicitations and many others to become a candidate to represent Knox and Sevier counties in the coming convention, I do so with great reluctance." For about 2 weeks previously, working men, politicians, business owners, and friends entreated General Mabry to run as a candidate for the floterial or floating district of Knox and Sevier counties. Now, Mabry likely believed himself a viable candidate as well. Mabry, in his own way, could claim ties to both rebels and Unionists. And ratified in the wake of the Civil War, the Constitution of 1870 was deeply influenced by those loyalties. And in the waning days of November, he accepted the nomination, claiming that he had no ambition to gratify and would consent to becoming the candidate as long as he didn't have to engage in a scuffle for the office. Now, despite his request otherwise, Mabry actually drew competitors. J.H. Caldwell and C.W. Hall also campaigned to represent the flotilla district. On December 18th, 1869, 60,000 Tennesseans cast their ballots in this to answer two important questions. One, whether there should be a constitutional convention, and two, who should serve as a delegate. And while snowstorms in East Tennessee kind of dampened the vote here, Mabry was able to win the nomination, and he won by a nearly 300 vote margin. Mabry would join a number of other delegates on January 10th, 1870 to begin to open the convention. And that's where I will leave off for Dr. Hardy to take over. Dr. William Hardy is a specialist in the 19th century American history, focusing on the Civil War, as well as Southern, Tennessee, and constitutional history. He has taught classes at Lincoln Memorial University, Tennessee Tech, University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and Chattanooga State Community College. Prior to earning his PhD in history at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, Dr. Hardy worked in public history at the East Tennessee Historical Center. He is currently finishing up a book on Knoxville's $1 Million Fire of 1897, writing an article on the origins of baseball, and that is 2 words in the 19th century, and revising his dissertation, Farewell to All Radicals, Redeeming Tennessee, 1869 to 1870 for publication. I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Hardy now. We do ask if you would like to hold your questions to the end, and we will have a Q&A at the conclusion of his talk. So without further ado, Dr. Hardy.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. I'm going to be talking about the Constitutional Convention of 1870 and the end of Tennessee's Reconstruction era, largely a period that lasted from 1865 to 1870. The talk will probably go 55 minutes or so. It is a big topic, complicated topic, but a story that's not been adequately told in its totality, certainly not in 70 years. So hopefully when the dissertation is published, this story will be up to date. So a lot of what I'm talking today is exactly what I spent several years at the University of Tennessee writing my dissertation under the great Civil War historian, Stephen Esch. The American Civil War shook the South to its core and triggered numerous aftershocks. Although the fighting between Billy Yank and Johnny Reb came to a close in the spring of 1865, the war remained largely unfinished. Great questions of the American Civil War were left unresolved, such as what to do about the South's 4 million former slaves. What was to be the status of the former Confederate states and their rebel citizens? And what direction should the country ultimately go in? These questions became the basis on which the war's former foes and even allies debated Reconstruction. The American Civil War had shifted now from battlefields across Virginia and Tennessee to the political arena of Reconstruction, a war now to be waged primarily, though certainly not exclusively, in state houses and the nation's capital. Tennessee's Reconstruction era, in particular, proved a turbulent one. However, certain commonalities in Tennessee's post-Civil War experience and that of the other former Confederate states existed. A desperate struggle among homegrown radicals, conservatives, and the ex-rebels for control of state government, the disfranchisement of the former rebels, a campaign of political terrorism that targeted white radicals and Blacks, and the quest of the freed people for social, political, legal, and economic equality. On the other hand, Tennessee's Reconstruction experience was in some ways unique. First among the former Confederate states to be readmitted to the Union, Tennessee avoided the military Reconstruction program imposed by congressional Republicans in 1867. Despite this, Tennessee became the first Southern state to enfranchise all Black males. The radicals who controlled the state government employed a state militia to police elections, protect recently enfranchised Blacks, suppress paramilitary terrorism, and thwart their political opponents, keeping the majority of Tennesseans in a permanent minority. Rather than achieving reconciliation, Tennessee's Reconstruction drove a deeper wedge between the state's Unionists and former Confederates. In Tennessee, the war and its aftermath brought to the forefront men unaccustomed to practicing the art of political compromise. Rebel Governor Isham G. Harris and Union military Governor Andrew Johnson, although veteran politicians, governed during the war with an authoritarian style of leadership. And excuse me just for a second, I'm going to try to get this screen to advance. I think that is what happened. All right, we're good. Okay, here's Isham G. Harris, the Tennessee's rebel governor. Harris trampled over state constitutional procedures and aligned Tennessee with the Confederacy before the state had even officially seceded. While Andrew Johnson wielded unprecedented power as military governor conferred by President Abraham Lincoln in an effort to reestablish a loyal civil government in Tennessee. Lincoln's lieutenant achieved this mission. Access to political power in Tennessee was now limited to those who swore an oath of allegiance to the federal government and also denounced the rebellion. As Johnson departed for Washington to commence his new role as Lincoln's vice president, he left behind a state torn asunder by war and political retribution. Tennessee's post-war governor, William Parson Brownlow, exacerbated tensions between Unionists and the former Confederates. Schooled in the art of invective as a circuit-riding Methodist preacher and partisan newspaperman, Brownlow brought to the governorship his own special blend of vituperation and uncompromising politics. In doing so, he stoked Tennessee's superheated post-war atmosphere. Unlike the middle and western divisions of the state, East Tennesseans overwhelmingly supported the Union, remaining steadfast in support of President Lincoln and the Republicans during the first 2 years of the war. But Lincoln and the Republicans' decision to place emancipation alongside the preservation of the Union as war goes drove a wedge that gradually split Tennessee Unionists. The unconditional Unionists, those who stood steadfast in their support of Lincoln and the Republicans throughout the war, became branded Lincolnites and eventually radical Republicans. But those who felt Lincoln and the Republicans had betrayed their constitutional pledge to support slavery in the Southern states became known as conditional Unionists and soon were known as conservatives by war's end. Governor Brownlow's homegrown radical Republicans took the reins of state government in the waning days of the American Civil War, thus exercising complete control of the volunteer state as a minority party over a bloc of conservative Unionists and a defeated rebel majority, unsure of how or whether they would fit into Brownlow's vision of post-war Tennessee. Brownlow's radicals were determined to stamp their authority over the state, to establish an electorate that was thoroughly loyal to the Union, to deny their former conditional Unionist allies, now conservatives, access to power, and to thoroughly punish the defeated rebels. At Brownlow's urging, the legislature enacted prescriptive measures to deny the vote to all former Confederates. To further ensure that rebels were barred from the ballot box, Brownlow's radical lawmakers established a voter registration system. In this system, Governor Brownlow appointed sympathetic county commissioners of registration and had them the power to set aside a county's registration if voter fraud or large numbers of Democratic rebel voters were suspected of voting. Southern Confederate apologists have long derided Brownlow and his radical legislature for their autocratic rule. They have coined pejorative epithets such as carpetbaggers and scalawags to refer to Northern outsiders and Southern turncoats, respectively, who exploited Reconstruction to seize political power, to line their pockets, to soil the South in a mass of infamy, corruption, and retribution. But joined with the quest for political power and profit is a reforming spirit that was alive and well throughout the South and in Tennessee. In Brownlow's radical state house, the governor's lieutenants championed Black suffrage, public education, and efforts to diversify the state's economy in the hope of instituting a new South on Tennessee soil, one based on free labor and industrial development. The so-called carpetbaggers and scalawags brought with them a reformer's zeal as they earnestly sought to uplift and educate the state's largely illiterate Black population, mollify racial animosity between whites and Blacks, and enact a radical economic vision for post-war Tennessee. First among the Confederate states to abolish slavery and enfranchise adult Black males, Tennessee stood at the vanguard of an unprecedented experiment, the establishment of biracial democracy in the South. Governor Brownlow's stunning conversion from pre-war racist ideologue to post-war radical defender of Black suffrage has long been attributed to political expediency. To be sure, Brownlow's radical party desperately needed the state's 40,000 Black voters to sustain political viability, as their support among the state's original bloc of wartime Unionists diminished as conditional Unionists troubled by emancipation, and Brownlow's authoritarianism drifted into becoming conservatives bent on subverting Brownlow's radical rule in Tennessee. Canvassing Black communities in an attempt to drive a wedge in the Republican ranks, anti-radicals warned potential voters that Brownlow and his white allies did not intend to share the reins of power with its second-class partners, but to dismiss Black Tennesseans as politically passive members of the Republican Party is to ignore the political organization and demands Black Tennesseans made in local union leagues and statewide colored conventions. Brownlow's support for Black suffrage and the flood of 40,000 eligible voters into his ranks spawned violent resistance. Local and more organized paramilitary groups such as the Ku Klux Klan threatened, beat, murdered Black and white radicals. To counter this threat, Brownlow declared war on the Klan by calling on the legislature to create a state militia, the Tennessee State Guard, and enact vigilant law enforcement measures. Brownlow's policies and practices alienated not only his political opponents, the disfranchised former rebels, and conditional Unionists, now conservatives who had the vote, but the governor's actions and his thirst for power began to drive a wedge within his own radical church. After having won re-election in 1867, Governor Brownlow immediately announced his intention to run and win one of Tennessee's 2 seats in the United States Senate. Because of Brownlow's poor health, few had expected Brownlow to enter the Senate race, and many of the governor's radical allies had been actively jockeying for the office. Radical U.S. Congressman and Union officer William B. Stokes believed that he had earned the right to the U.S. Senate seat after speaking on behalf of Brownlow, who had been too ill to campaign for re-election as governor. Intra-party factional rivalries intensified as embittered radical hardliners who had faithfully pledged their fidelity to Brownlow, waiting for him to cede power or seats to open, now organized themselves in opposition to Brownlow. When Stokes refused to withdraw from the race, he drew the full wrath of Brownlow, who then defeated Stokes to temporarily silence his radical bolters within Tennessee's Republican Party. When Brownlow eventually ceded gubernatorial power to become a United States Senator in February 1869, he left a state Republican Party that he himself had largely nurtured into existence, now torn asunder, divided into two bitter camps, one led by DeWitt Clinton Center, Speaker of the State Senate, who would temporarily assume the governorship under the state constitution. The other led by William Stokes. Both camps eager to fill the vacuum created by the Parsons' departure from Tennessee. On resigning, Brownlow expressed full confidence in Center, proclaiming, quote, "My regrets on retiring would be greater were it not that the gentleman who will succeed me for the remainder of my official term is a loyal man, capable, tried, and trusty, who is sound in his principles, and who will steadfastly adhere to them upon the platform of the Union Republican Party of Tennessee." And I'm going to take a quick second here. Notice that my screen is paused. So I'm going to ask Mr. Hollis, if I move now, can you see those screens? Okay, thank you. And I apologize to those out there who have missed some pretty pictures of some grisly looking old men who really, you don't really want to look too much at Parson Brownlow too close. Okay. So now Brownlow has resigned and expressed full confidence in his successor, Center. But Center, like many wartime Unionists before him, had begun to gradually loosen the bonds of fidelity to Brownlow's brand of radicalism, to break with his party's leader over the administration's proscriptive measures, its disfranchisement of former rebels and even former Unionists who had now steered away from Brownlow's radical church and become conservatives. Although few conservatives and former rebels and even Stoke hardline radicals would have been able to grasp it in early 1869, but Center's ascension into the state's gubernatorial chair offered some hope of reconciliation in Tennessee, an end to nearly a decade of partisan warfare in the state. Brownlow's successor sought to achieve the impossible, to inject the essence of democracy, compromise, into Tennessee's volatile political climate. Once in the governorship, Center signaled a departure from the extreme partisanship of his predecessors as he struggled to stay afloat amid the strong political tides generated by the autocratic administrations of Harris, Johnson, and Brownlow before him. The era of Reconstruction came to an impromptu but decisive close in Tennessee with Brownlow's departure, or so goes the traditional narrative. That's where my story comes in, my dissertation, which now I'm giving sort of the highlights at this point. It is, according to this older version of events, Center, with no warning, suddenly broke with the radicals and cast his lot with the conservatives. One historian observed that from the viewpoint of the anti-radicals, Center deserved the lion's share of the credit for redeeming Tennessee from radical rule. Yet Tennessee's Reconstruction did not cease with Center's ascension to the governorship. Center neither colluded with nor abdicated power to the former Confederates. Rather, Again, he sought to achieve the impossible in Tennessee and inject compromise into Tennessee politics. At this tumultuous period in Tennessee's history, no one could have governed in a way that was acceptable to all: radicals, moderate Republicans, conservatives, ex-rebels, and even the freed people of Tennessee. At best, unable to bridge the political divide, Center proved an unwitting redeemer whose policies, against his best intentions, hastened the end of Tennessee's Reconstruction and the resurrection of rebel rule in Tennessee once more. The son of a prominent East Tennessee Methodist preacher and Whig, Center quickly scaled Tennessee's political ladder, winning a seat in the lower state house in 1857 at the age of 27. When Tennessee seceded in June 1861, Center retained his seat in the legislature, professing that he would not shirk from his responsibility to represent the state's Unionists. In March 1862, the rebel legislature adjourned and Center attempted to return to his home in Granger County. However, Confederate soldiers captured him, and he spent the next 6 months in rebel prisons. After posting a $4,000 bond and taking an oath not to bear arms against the Confederacy, Center finally returned home to Granger County. He was reelected to the state legislature after the restoration of civil government in Tennessee in January 1865. And 2 years later, he assumed the position of Speaker of the Senate, putting himself right in the spot to assume the governorship when Brownlow departed. In this role as Speaker of the Senate, he supported the policies of Governor Brownlow and Brownlow's Republican Party, including the disfranchisement of former Confederates and the enfranchisement, the right to give the right to vote to African Americans. Publicly, Brownlow exuded confidence in Center, owing in large part to the fact that Center had remained loyal to him when Stokes and other radicals, frustrated at being blocked from access to power, bolted from Brownlow's radical camp. But privately, Brownlow questioned whether Center would maintain his radical agenda in Tennessee. A closer examination of Center's voting record indicated that he had from time to time exercised his own political independence from Brownlow, steering a moderate course towards a more compassionate, reconciling, embracing, forward-thinking, and diverse Southern Republican Party. The first indication that Center sought to steer a moderate course through Tennessee's tumultuous political waters came 2 months into his administration, when he relaxed Brownlow's martial law and disbanded Brownlow's state militia, which was draining the state's treasury and had no enemy to fight because Nathan Bedford Forrest's Ku Klux Klan had gone underground under the false pretense that the Klan leader had disbanded his army after finally seeing the Klan for what it was: a terroristic paramilitary arm of the former Confederacy, which aimed to preserve white supremacy, subject the freed people to a status as near slavery as possible, and restore rebel rule. As the state's Republican Party met in May 1869 to nominate a candidate for governor, the proceedings dissolved into chaos. Neither Center nor Stokes emerged as the party's gubernatorial nominee, and a permanent line was drawn in Tennessee's Republican sand between the party's radical Stokes hardliners on one side and the party's moderate center Republicans on the other. The next political aftershock occurred when Center, getting wind of a state Supreme Court ruling to be announced in the case of State versus Staten, a decision that would extend the vote to approximately 30,000 conservatives previously stripped of the ballot by Brownlow's prescriptive franchise laws. Center suddenly announced his support of immediate universal male suffrage. That is, Center announced that he was supporting granting the right to vote to all Tennesseans males over the age of 21 or older. The implication of Center's announcement to call for the right to vote to be restored to Tennessee's rebel population shook the state, and especially Stokes and his radical supporters to the core. Though Center had defended the necessity of Brownlow's franchise laws to bar rebels from voting to prevent the state from being thrown into anarchy and to protect Unionists from proscription, violence, murder, and exile following the war, now Center argued was the time to restore the right to vote to all Tennesseans regardless of their wartime affiliations. It had been 5 years, or 4 years at this point. It was a calculated decision on Center's part to gain the political center, to establish what he hoped would be a loyal, moderate Republican Party that could bring the conservatives and eventually moderate, forward-thinking Democrats into his fold. With the state Supreme Court ruling in State v. Stanton opening up access to the ballot to previously disfranchised conservatives, Center sought to ensure the electoral math that the majority of states' eligible voters were securely in his camp. When Brownlow's radical appointed voting registrars refused to abide by the ruling of the state Supreme Court and grant voting certificates to conservatives, Center removed those registrars. In their place, he appointed not only moderate Republicans, but also some conservatives in those voting registrar positions, especially in the western and middle grand divisions of the state, a move to improve his standing among conservatives and Democrats. Throughout the gubernatorial campaign, Center replaced all but a few of Brownlow's registrars with commissioners who, in most cases, basically enrolled any native male of the requisitive age, including former rebels. Radicals challenged these voting certificates. However, the state's moderate attorney general concluded that anyone granted a voting certificate by a gubernatorial appointed commissioner of registration could not be indicted for illegal voting. That August, in the contest for governor, Center received a statewide total of 120,303 votes to Center's 55,066 votes. In the legislative races, the conservatives who had stayed out of the gubernatorial race and sided with Center, they ran competitively in the state races, and the conservatives, now eligible to vote in mass, won a decisive victory, placing both houses of the General Assembly under conservative control. Hardly was the ballot counting finished before a delegation of disgruntled Stokes radicals, led by Stokes himself, descended on the nation's capital in the hope of persuading sympathetic congressional Republicans and President Ulysses S. Grant to investigate the legality of the election. The national press sought out Stokes, who reportedly held numerous meetings behind closed doors with influential men in Washington. When asked to comment on the election, Stokes remarked, "The Republican Party in Tennessee has gone to hell." He wanted the president to call Congress into special session to consider the situation in Tennessee. To the radicals' consternation, Center and a party of his friends who had followed Stokes to Washington beat them to the president. Center put the president's mind at ease over the conservatives' victory and dissuaded him from either calling Congress into session or sending U.S. troops into Tennessee. When Grant inquired if Stokes had received any rebel votes, Governor Center replied emphatically that he had not. Quote, "Then the rebels all voted for you?" asked Grant. Center replied, quote, "No, sir, I did not get any rebel votes. We have no rebels in Tennessee now," end quote. The former rebels were, Center explained, thoroughly reconstructed, and his victory was due to a combination of moderate Republicans, conservatives, and moderate leaders of the old Democratic Party, all of whom favored peace, law, and order. Satisfied, President Grant recognized Center as a legitimate Republican in lockstep with his campaign call to, quote, let us have peace, end quote. Stokes met with the president the following day. Though President Grant proved sympathetic to the Tennessee radicals' plight, he refused to become involved in the state's election. Likewise, congressional Republicans balked at conducting an investigation. Had East Tennesseans remained firmly loyal to the Radical Party, to Stokes' hardline radicals, the prospects of federal intervention might have been greater. But Center's victory there in East Tennessee, and in particularly in Stokes' own county and congressional district, were decisively discouraging to those in Washington, to those radical Republicans in Washington who might have been inclined to intervene. Although Center had for the time being forestalled the possibility of federal intervention, he did not rest easy. Center was determined to build a bridge to welcome conservatives into a reconstituted Republican Party along moderate lines and focusing on pressing issues of economic development. Center's coalition came unraveled in the days after the election of 1869. The conservatives' sweeping victory in the legislature represented a sharp turn in the course of Tennessee's Reconstruction. Despite Governor Center's efforts to adopt a policy of moderation and reconciliation, the newly elected conservatives in the State House went quickly to work, determined to dismantle Brownlow's radical state, repealing nearly 5 years of Brownlowism, one act at a time. By the end of its session, the conservative legislature had passed 125 public and private acts, 93 joint resolutions. The majority of these repealed or amended radical legislation. Governor Center and his supporters had entertained high hopes of a political realignment by which radicals, center Republicans, conservatives, and even some Democrats would work together to preserve the best of what the state government had achieved since the war's end and move Tennessee and Tennesseans toward a more progressive future. But the conservatives and their soon-to-be rebel allies, who were waiting to break bread and communion with them, had other ideas. Thus, a conservative-dominated legislature, composed almost wholly of wartime Unionists, took every step but the last in restoring the government of Tennessee to the ex-rebels and the Democratic Party. All that remained to complete the work of redemption was to put the final nail in the coffin of Brownlowism and draft a new state constitution. The conservatives on the ballot in 1869, running for the state legislature, had announced their intention, if elected, to immediately call for a constitutional convention. And thus, the state legislature, now firmly under conservative control, voted in favor of a constitutional convention. On December 18th, 1869, some 60,000 Tennesseans went to the polls. They approved the call for a constitutional convention by a 5-1 margin. The chief objective of the great majority of the voters was to remove all remaining restrictions on voting, thus restoring to full citizenship the former Confederates who had been disfranchised by the radical Republicans. But the potential threat of federal intervention still hung over Tennessee and would play a psychological role during the proceedings because congressional Republicans had not hesitated to return Georgia to military rule in late December 1869, after that state legislature had acted to expel its Black members. In addition to demanding that the Georgia legislature purge its ineligible ex-rebel members and reseat its eligible Black members, Congress stipulated that Georgia must ratify the 15th Amendment as a condition of readmission. This action stood as a warning to those delegates elected to Tennessee's Constitutional Convention who would oppose biracial democracy. All but the most unrepentant rebels understood the need to proceed with great caution in this constitutional convention. With this in mind, Tennessee's conservative and Democratic newspaper editors demanded that only sensible and moderate men be considered as delegates. As one newspaper editor proclaimed, quote, The architects of ruin, that is, the reckless ex-rebels unwilling to forget the past, should be shunned from this convention. Surely Tennessee's radicals would want to be represented at the convention to thwart the conservatives and any Democratic delegates from wiping away every last vestige of radicalism from the state's law of the land. However, Stokes proclaimed that the convention is illegal, unconstitutional, void, and revolutionary. The Constitution and laws have been wholly disregarded in the late election, necessarily making void all laws passed by that illegal and unconstitutional body. Stokes urged radicals to boycott the vote for the Constitutional Convention and not to run as delegates, thus making themselves complicit in granting the proceedings legitimacy. Stokes remained wedded, though, to calling on Congress to intervene and throw out the results of the 1869 state election. For the most part, Middle and West Tennessee radicals heeded Stokes' advice. The radicals and their freedmen allies largely boycotted the election, some of which may have been caused due to the Klan's resurgence in those parts of the state. Only in Tennessee and other sections of the state free of terrorist violence did the radicals, black and white, cast ballots in large numbers. The Constitutional Convention convened in Nashville on January 10th, 1870, meeting here in the Davidson County Courthouse, which was designed in 1857 by Francis Strickland, who was the son of William Strickland, who had built the Tennessee state capitol. The convention was, in the words of one constitutional historian, quote, probably the most intellectual body of men that ever assembled in Tennessee for any purpose, end quote. Of the 75 delegates, 40 were lawyers, and an additional 18 had been to college. A majority had either legislative or judicial experience prior to the war. Among them, a former governor of the state, a United States senator, 3 congressmen, not to mention a number of prominent jurists, 2 of which later became Tennessee Supreme Court justices. As in the legislature, conservatives were plentiful among the delegates, but they only slightly outnumbered their antebellum political rivals, who since the August 1869 election were beginning now to openly refer to themselves as Democrats. On average, slightly older, but far more politically experienced than the legislators, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention represented a bridge between Tennessee's past and present. The number of delegates who had served in the Confederacy was the most obvious sign that the Reconstruction in Tennessee was on its deathbed. 4 had held seats in the Confederate Congress. At least 9 had been high-ranking Confederate military officials, while many others had held lesser rank. One Wilson County radical surveyed the convention's personnel and concluded that 41 of the 75 delegates had served in some capacity in the rebel army. In contrast, only 4 of the 75 delegates had served in the Union Army. With only 7 delegates in total, the radicals were virtually powerless against their opponents in the convention. The radical Republicans were led by Henry Gibson and Joseph Blackburn, the latter a Union and State Guard officer who at the 11th hour had surprised the 2 conservative candidates for delegates by announcing his candidacy and marshaling local radicals and some of his former soldiers to secure his victory. But outnumbered, their only hope was that Stokes and his radical supporters in Washington would manage to convince congressional Republicans and or President Ulysses S. Grant to put the state under military rule to throw out the results of the 1869 state election. The most influential bloc at the convention were the conservatives. But this was a party that was itself experiencing a political realignment of sorts. Those who had been Unionists and even reluctant rebels sought to gain control of Tennessee's political center, the very ground that Governor Center had sought to achieve with the conservatives. Among its leaders in the convention were former Governor Neal S. Brown, his brother John Brown, Joseph B. High School, and James D. Porter. However, the bulk of the conservatives gradually fused with another group represented at the convention, the moderate Democratic delegates, such as A.O.P. Nicholson, to form a dominant voting bloc. One East Tennessee Democratic delegate who frequently sided with Nicholson, a voice of caution and conservatism, was the very man who built the home that we are in tonight in 1858, the Mabry-Hazen House. Of course, I'm referring to Joseph Alexander Mabry of Knox County. Mabry was a flatorial candidate, that is, representing not just Knox, but also Sevier counties. His 300 plus margin of victory in Knox County was more than enough to negate disappointing results that he received in Sevier County. For the most part, Mabry was not necessarily any more active or less active than most delegates in terms of motions made, amendments proposed, or previous questions and yeas and nays demanded. He did, however, serve on the prestigious Committee on Finance, and he did seem to take an interest in discussions on the state's finances, state debt, and especially railroads. One may draw the conclusion that Mabry used his election to the state constitutional convention to network with other Tennessee lawmakers and businessmen to secure necessary funding for his railroad ventures. Unrepented Democrats, rebel Democrats, including James Fentress of Hardeman County, who had served under General Nathan Bedford Forrest and would become perhaps the most hostile opponent of Black suffrage during the convention, and William Henry Williamson, comprised yet another faction to deal with. They shared the views of the fire-eating rebel leaders still in exile, such as former Governor Isham Harris and former rebel officers William B. Pate and Peter Turney, men who would become future governors. Finally, there was a very small faction of men loyal to former President Andrew Johnson, a mixed bag of Unionist Democrats, Whigs such as Absalom Cowell, and Confederate Democrats like George Washington Jones, an old Jacksonian who rigidly adhered to the party's antebellum core principles. Which faction or factions would gain control of the convention was the question of the hour. The fear that hotheads would take over the convention also prompted moderate Democrats such as A.O.P. Nicholson to speak out. Nicholson said, quote, "Let us be careful. Let us do more. Let us do no more than absolutely necessary," end quote. Another Democrat who chose the path of moderation was former Confederate Captain John Allen of Smith County, Tennessee. Though an ardent secessionist who bore the scars of several battlefield wounds and inclined to adopt the extreme course favored by many other rebel veterans, Allen had had second thoughts after receiving a letter from John Bowen, one of the radicals' fiercest conservative critics. Bowen urged Allen to counsel his former rebels to refrain from giving in to their passions and prejudice. Failure to do so might jeopardize all that had been accomplished through the wisest course of statesmanship during the election of 1869. Bowen warned, quote, "A fierce, malignant, and despotic party in possession of all the power of the federal government is watching with evil eye, anxious to find in some act of the convention excuse to place upon the people the crushing heel of military power," end quote. Heeding Bowen's advice, Allen took a stand with the moderate Democrats. Thus, caution and conservatism were the general rule guiding most of the decisions at the state convention. The first task of the delegates was to elect a president, and the choice was obvious. Since responding to the call of voters to represent Giles, Lincoln, and Marshall counties in the convention, former Confederate officer John Calvin Brown had risen to prominence. Although he had never held governmental office, he had been active in state politics. As his older brother, Neil Brown, assumed the governorship in 1847, the younger Brown established a successful law practice. An ardent antebellum Whig, he seemed poised to follow in his big brother's footsteps. As the nation teetered on the brink of civil war, he took to the stump from town to town across Middle and West Tennessee, denouncing the fire-eating Democrats as disunionists bent on civil war. When Governor Harris and the legislature submitted the question of secession to a popular referendum the first time in February 1861, Brown took to the stump again in defense of the Union. Tennesseans had rejected secession, but only temporarily in February 1861. Lincoln's April 1861 call for troops to put the rebellion down in the wake of the firing on Fort Sumter galvanized Middle and West Tennesseans, and the state soon turned toward secession. Like many of his fellow former Whigs in these regions of Middle and West Tennessee, Brown now cast his lot with Tennessee and the rebel army. Promoted repeatedly for battlefield gallantry, Brown surrendered with the rebel rank of Major General. After the war, Brown returned to his home in Pulaski, Tennessee, resuming his law practice, and kept a relatively low profile. But Brownlow's radical regime deprived him and his fellow rebel soldiers of the right to vote. Brown and other disfranchised ex-rebels in Giles County organized the Ku Klux Klan. He became an active leader of the secret fraternal society and sanctioned many of its activities, including political obstruction and intimidation to thwart radical rule in Tennessee. As an antebellum Whig, staunch opponent of secession turned rebel general and Klan leader, Brown was well suited to appeal to both conservatives and Democrats. He represented a young, vigorous, rising class of leaders, and yet won the approval of Tennessee's elder statesmen, thanks to his political lineage. Now it seemed that Brown, not center, was poised to be the man who would bridge the political divide in Tennessee, establish some sense of a political center, though more than slightly askew of center's moderate Republican vision for Tennessee. Brown's unanimous election as president of the convention marked yet another critical step in Tennessee's redemption. Following his election, Brown addressed the convention. He expressed the sentiment of the majority of the delegates, cautioning against extreme measures that might provoke the federal government to intervene in Tennessee. He said, quote, "Let us raise ourselves above the passions and prejudice of the hour and dare to be just and generous, regardless of the temptations prompting a contrary course. We cannot, we must not be unmindful of the great changes that have impressed themselves upon our history. Let us accept the situation and not seek to alter circumstances which have passed beyond our control," end quote. In the subsequent debates, Brown participated very little. He considered his role to be nonpartisan during the convention, much like a George Washington at the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The primary aim of Brown and his supporters was to curb the extremism at both ends of Tennessee's political spectrum. On the second day of the convention, the delegates addressed the primary question before the convention, the revision of the franchise provisions of the Constitution, those concerning the right to vote. While there was a consensus in favor of sweeping away the radical franchise laws, restoring the vote to all white males 21 or older, there was serious disagreement on Black suffrage. Fear that the most unrepentant rebels would move to strip the freedmen of the right to vote and result in the full weight of radical federal rule raining down upon them, a coalition of conservatives and moderate Democrats proposed a compromise, a resolution providing for universal male suffrage, but also mandating payment of a poll tax as a prerequisite for voting. The poll tax had a long history in Tennessee. The Constitution of 1796 and 1834 had instituted a poll tax, but in neither case was payment of it or any other tax made a requirement for voting. Rather than be forthright, Those arguing for it in the convention claimed its purpose was to provide revenue for public schools. However, everyone knew the poll tax was a means to an end, reducing the Black vote in Tennessee. Rebel hardliners, however, were in no mood to compromise. On the third day of the convention, they introduced a series of resolutions that would explicitly restrict the right to vote to white males. Their arguments were openly racist. One boasted, quote, that this government was made for the white man and his posterity forever, end quote. James Fentress asserted that, quote, the white man is and ought to be the controller of the political affairs of the state. We hold that the inferiority of the Negro to the white man in race, color, and capacity for a permanent, well-ordered government has been fixed by God, end quote. William Blunt Carter of Carter County suggested that if the convention enfranchised blacks, it might as well give the vote to 5-year-olds. William Thompson considered slavery, quote, one of the greatest blessings to the country. But Uncle Sam came along and took my Negroes, end quote. Wearied by these lengthy tirades, conservative and moderate Democrats moved to limit these speeches to 15 minutes per delegates. However, President John Brown ruled against them. Confident that they would be defeated in the end, Brown permitted the extremists to blow off some steam. He realized that many of these speeches were being made largely for public consumption back home, because the 15th Amendment to the federal Constitution was well on its way toward ratification by 3/5 of the required states to become law of the land, with or without Tennessee's blessing, as would be the case, the latter. John C. Thompson of Davidson County said that the threat of federal intervention, a sword suspended over the convention, did not intimidate him. Quote, if the sword falls, let it fall. We shall have lost all but our honor, end quote. The hardliners moved to submit the question of black suffrage to the people as a separate referendum, in which people would be compelled to mark their ballots either for Negro suffrage, that is universal male suffrage, or white suffrage, that is not in favor of black voting. Even Joseph Mabry felt inclined to profess his rebel credentials during the proceedings, as he rose to give a personal explanation about a speech in which William Stokes in Congress had misrepresented him as a Union man during the war, a story that had been reprinted in newspapers across the nation. Although Mabry did not consider being a Union man a dishonorable trait, he did, however, want the record clear that he had been a rebel, and a zealous one at that, during the war. He professed to not being a politician, and that he merely sought to preserve the peace of his community and state, but that he had been persecuted and hounded and sued and indicted, but that he lived to face his persecutors, and that he was ready to face them in Nashville or elsewhere. He suggested that at least one, if not more delegates in the room had pursued him during the war, in the halls of the legislature, and even in the courtroom. Such men were still upon his tracks, but he argued that these men, who were destitute of manly courage and principle, were too coward to meet him outside in the streets. One wonders that as he gave this speech, whether Mabry was staring daggers at his fellow delegate and Knox County neighbor, John Baxter, who shortly after the convention adjourned, Mabry would shoot in the wrist while in front of the Lamar House Hotel, today the Bijou Theater on Gay Street. Finally, after all this rebel bloviating, AOP Nicholson warned the advocates of black disfranchisement that they were courting danger. Quote, this is not the time to talk about states' rights or the inferiority of the Negro. This is the wrong time to apply these great truths and principles. Nicholson reminded them that the congressional Republicans were watching these proceedings from Washington, seeking justification to meddle in Tennessee's affairs. Quote, let us give more thought to political expediency and less to racial doctrine, end quote. Conservatives then moved to reject the hardliners' referendum in favor of the payment of a poll tax to be required of the voters. Supporters of the poll tax argued that its revenue would fund public schools and, in the words of William Stevens of Shelby County, disfranchise the unworthy, quote, scum and riffraff, end quote. Bolin Gordon of Hickman County was more forthright as he reaffirmed his belief in Black inferiority and supported a poll tax that would, quote, cut off a great many irresponsible voters, end quote. Opposition to the poll tax was not confined to the radicals, since opponents of the tax charged that it was discriminated against the poor. Voting was an inherent right, they argued, not a privilege extended to the affluent. Moreover, such a tax created the potential for corruption of the political process, and it could deprive thousands of white Tennesseans of the vote, while not necessarily guaranteeing Black disfranchisement. The payment of the poll tax as a prerequisite for voting was too much for George Jones, who stormed out of the convention hall, went home to Fayetteville, and brought his 4 decades of public service to an abrupt end. Although the convention approved universal male suffrage with a poll tax included, the tax was not levied in Tennessee until 1890. The work of redemption continued during the last few weeks of the convention. The delegates imposed certain checks and balances on the state's governmental departments to prevent the arbitrary exercise of power that had characterized Tennessee's radicalism. The legislature was forbidden to give state aid to private enterprises. No General Assembly or convention could act on proposed federal amendments unless elected subsequent to submission of the amendment by Congress of the state. These measures were responses to the radicals' extravagant state aid to railroads and the irregular ratification of the 14th Amendment. The delegates also limited the pay of legislators to 75 days for a regular session and 20 days for an extra session, to discourage protracted and costly legislative sessions. Regarding the executive department, the convention conferred the veto power on the governor, albeit a weak veto power. A bare majority of the legislature could override, and restricted the governor's use of the militia and martial law. Constitutional provisions regarding the judiciary were significantly revised. Besides mandating the election of state Supreme Court justices, the delegates enlarged the court to 5 members, allowing no more than 2 from any single grand division of the state, to forestall any quarrel about the initial makeup of the court, as well as to help clear the huge backlog of cases consisting primarily of unresolved legal disputes stemming from the Civil War. The new Constitution provided for a court of 6 judges initially, 2 from each grand division. The first judge to vacate his seat after January 1873 would not be replaced. The judges were empowered to choose a chief justice from among themselves and to appoint the state attorney general, whose term was extended from 6 to 8 years. In a move that angered the radicals, the delegates required all judicial officers to have resided in the state at least 5 years. This provision was designed to exclude many of the so-called Republican carpetbaggers who held office in Middle and West Tennessee. In the course of 6 weeks, the delegates had accomplished their primary task of wresting control of the state government from a minority party and restoring the former Confederates to power. The work of redemption seemed complete. But then William Thompson rose to point out that the convention had failed to address one of Brownlow's infamous election tactics, and one that Center had in fact used to redress Brownlow's autocratic rule, the governor's arbitrary appointment of commissioners of registration, who by law were supposed to be elected. After some discussion, moderates moved to suspend the rules and quickly adopt an amendment that prevented the governor from arbitrarily naming someone to fill any county office created by the legislature. And with that, on February 23rd, 1870, 151 years ago today, the Constitutional Convention of 1870 adjourned sine die. All but 8 of the delegates signed the new Constitution. The non-signers included all 7 radical delegates, as well as a longtime Democrat, George Jones, who had stormed out of the convention a week earlier, frustrated over the adoption of a poll tax. Though the rebel hardliners all signed, though the rebel hardliners all signed the document, none were fully satisfied. James Fentress filed a protest on their behalf, declaring that allowing Black suffrage, quote, is a direct encouragement of a party whose object is, by usurpation, to destroy our Republican system and to establish in its stead a consolidated despotism, end quote. Many had expected the delegates to finish their work in a week or two at most. However, it became evident during the debate over the franchise that even if the convention adjourned by early February, there would be insufficient time to submit the proposed constitution to the people of at the regular county elections, which were scheduled for the first Saturday in March. Therefore, the delegates adopted a resolution urging the legislature to postpone the county elections until the last Saturday in March. The legislature promptly obliged. With a little more than a month to review the document, conservative and moderate Democratic leaders took to the stump to rally support for the new Constitution. Former Governor Neal Brown traveled through Middle and West Tennessee, urging the voters to support ratification. Quote, reject it and they would have back again test those and certificates of registration and taxation without representation, he warned. Adopt it and all men would be set free, end quote. What Brown and others learned as they addressed the crowds was that although many white Tennesseans detested the inclusion of Black suffrage, most resistance and anger stemmed from the poll tax clause. The fate of Reconstruction and volunteer state was now in the hands of the federal government. Many Tennessee radicals continued to hold out hope that either Congress or President Grant would intervene and invalidate the state's 1869 election. But neither Congress nor the White House appeared interested in pursuing the matter. Privately, Grant held Governor Center personally responsible for handing the state over to the rebel democracy. However, he did not want to risk starting a second civil war. Moreover, the case of Tennessee presented a legal dilemma. Tennessee had never been subjected to congressional reconstruction, and the extent to which the federal government could properly intervene in the state was unclear. When Grant asked his attorney general, the nation's chief legal officer, for a ruling, it was decided that so long as the Tennessee legislature could be convened, there was no legal ground for federal intervention, and therefore Grant decided against intervening in Tennessee's affairs. As Tennesseans gathered at the polls on March 26, 1870, to cast their vote for or against the Constitution, heavy rains and snowstorms swept across the state, resulting in a drop of some 40,000 voters from the 1869 election. In the end, Middle and West Tennesseans overwhelmingly supported ratification, and the new Constitution was approved by a vote of 98,128 to 33,872. The editor of the Columbia Herald proclaimed the state redeemed. Quote, the issues out of which great animosities between the different peoples of our Commonwealth are settled and disposed of forever. The disfranchised citizens are enfranchised, and the state is at peace, end quote. Subjugated and powerless, radical Republicans retreated for the most part into the mountains and valleys of East Tennessee. For those radicals in the highlands and central basin of Middle Tennessee and plateau slope of West Tennessee, there was no refuge to be found. One Gibson County radical begged for federal protection. Quote, don't forget us here in poor, rebel-ridden Tennessee. Tell President Grant our woeful story. He must believe, end quote. But there would be no aid from Washington. Tennessee was, for all intents and purposes, now redeemed, and most radicals grudgingly accepted the truth. Well, said one radical, we have got to submit and come under rebel rule once more, end quote. For Tennessee Blacks, especially Civil War veterans, this was a dark and perilous time. The Klan roamed unchecked through Middle and West Tennessee's countryside, day and night, terrorizing Blacks. White mobs seized Black prisoners from county jails and carried them off to be tortured or lynched. Many of the freed people continued bravely to seek justice and exercise their political rights, but many others gave up in fear and frustration, and some even immigrating from the state. Although Governor Center was disappointed by many of the actions taken by the legislature in the Constitutional Convention, he had maintained cordial relations with their conservative leaders. In turn, the conservatives and Democratic press applauded Center for not interfering with the legislature or the Constitutional Convention. However, a surge in Ku Kluxism in late 1869 and into early 1870, and the legislature's refusal to grant his request to call out the militia tested Center's patience. Handcuffed by conservative lawmakers, Center threw cold water on those who encouraged him to seek federal intervention to get congressional Republicans to place Tennessee under the Reconstruction Acts. Center said, quote, "I'm not in favor of Reconstruction and never have been. All I desired in calling for troops was the protection of our people, and not with any view of furthering any Reconstruction scheme," end quote. Center's conservative and Democratic 1869 election allies had used him as a means to an end, that is, to secure the ballot. Their political resurgence and ascendancy to power, and the end of Tennessee's Reconstruction. Center had come to realize that he was a man without a party. Most Republicans refused to forgive him for selling out the party in the 1869 election. Privately, Center cursed the conservative legislature. He accused the legislators of going back on their pledge that they had pledged to him to ratify the 15th Amendment, criticized their repeal of the more admirable acts of radical Reconstruction, such as the Common School Law, and damned them for failing to cooperate with his efforts to forge a centrist party. The legislature, Center said, quote, "has succeeded in one thing, and that is making all preceding ones respectable," end quote. To those who held him responsible for the collapse of Reconstruction and the restoration of rebel democratic rule, he insisted that, quote, "under no circumstances will I ever join hands with that rotten, defunct party known as the Democratic Party," end quote. With no hope of securing re-election under the new state constitution, Center quietly served out the remainder of his term and then retired to private life on a farm near Morristown, Tennessee. The next state election, scheduled according to the new constitution, was scheduled for the second Tuesday in November of 1870. The Constitutional Convention's president, John C. Brown, was the odds-on favorite for the governorship. The Republicans failed to mount a serious challenge to Brown, and the results were never in doubt. Brown won by a vote of 78,979 to 41,500. In addition to securing the governorship, the conservatives, now branding themselves under the Democratic umbrella, increased their majorities in both houses of the legislature and won all but 2 congressional races. The Democratic Party was now in firm control of Tennessee's government, with a former rebel governor at the helm, a former rebel general at the helm. Contributing to their victory were shrewd party leadership and shadowy acts of intimidation by the Ku Klux Klan and other groups of white Southerners bent on reestablishing a white man's democracy. Also contributing to the collapse of Reconstruction in Tennessee was Republican inter-party conflict and a loss of support from the Northern public and the federal government. Efforts to reunite the Republican Party came too late to prevent the Democratic takeover of the state government. With the election of Governor Brown and the restoration of democratic rule, Tennessee's Reconstruction era had come to an end. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Hardy, thank you so much for your thoughts and wide scope of information there. I actually had not heard that story about the Mabry speech before, where he basically was trying to rep his rebel background there. So I'll have to ask you about that. Otherwise, I will go ahead and open up the floor for questions. We did have a couple questions come in through the chat. So we'll start off with, how was it that Mabry and the radical Brownlow seemed to help each other when one of them tended to need some help? I guess why were Brownlow and Mabry friends, or at least, seem to be having common interests?
My goodness. I think that's almost a question I'd hate to tread on your ground. This is your territory, sir. You are the expert on this. I mean, I know a little bit about how Mabry could play both sides during the Civil War, and as a pragmatic businessman, I would defer to you. I'm smart enough to know that you are the most knowledgeable person
Well,
about
I'm
Mr.
humbled.
Mabry.
So, well, my answer would be as Mabry and Brownlow have a relationship going back to the Civil War. I'm not exactly sure how it started. Maybe, both Mabry and Brownlow were boosters, promoters of Knoxville in the right before the the irreconcilable differences arising from the Civil War. And Mabry also purchased Brownlow's wig, the Brownlow's former newspaper, just a few years beforehand. So there's some sort of relationship there. I've even found evidence of Mabry bribing Brownlow at one point after Mabry had speculated on bonds in New York City. But unfortunately, I don't have any sort of kind of real details in how their relationship was established or built. It's just they have this ongoing kind of relationship, and most of it seems to be commercial and business.
And I think the thing about Tennessee is if you study Tennessee Civil War politics, you know about strange bedfellows, the people that one moment were on opposite sides of the political spectrum soon find themselves together, aligned. And especially in the business, in my own work that I'm doing, whether it's my research into Tennessee Civil War era baseball in Knoxville, or even the Great Fire of 1897, there are business people who have partnerships where you can find Democrats and Republicans together, former Unionists and Confederates together. It's not uncommon in Knoxville. And throughout East Tennessee, you'll find these things in our sister city of Chattanooga, these kind of same relationships where when it comes to business, you can set aside your political differences because there's a lot of money to be had in the post-Civil War experience here in Tennessee and especially East Tennessee.
Looks like we're going to have a question asked verbally here in a second. If you want to, I've allowed you guys to go ahead and unmute. So if you want to also just ask your question straight up, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
Thanks so much, Patrick. Doctor, thank you so very much for spending this time with us. It was an excellence to hear you speak. My question to you, sir, is I'm wanting to look at this more of a scientific view in my research as far as when the Constitution for Tennessee was pretty much redone and so on forth. Was the ideals of the time where you did have such staunch resistance to African American, not only representation in the House, but also legal voting rights? Was that, and I'm talking about in context, sir, for the time period, were these people in a way brainwashed to think that these people were either a subhuman race of human being, or that they did not hold the ideals that we hold? Or I'm just trying to find more or less the context of the sentiment. Because I mean, in everyday life, I'm sure whether it was in a normal Tennesseans or in someone's stature of Mr. Mabry, these human interactions that we have with people every day, and I'm sure in those times, the sentiment of military occupation in Tennessee with the constituency of Tennesseans and the loss of mass male life from the war, did that not drive the sentiment of what the radical Republicans were not able to get done?
And the short answer, yes. You cross the South, even in the North, there is charges from Southerners of Northern hypocrisy at the end of the war. We're talking about Northerners. When they have an opportunity to put Black suffrage, Black right to vote on the ballot, there's a number of Northern states that reject it in the immediate post-Civil War period. I mean, this is before 15th Amendment. We're talking 1865, 1866. And you would think, well, didn't the North fight for emancipation? Well, no, it wasn't the original war goal. It was preservation of the Union. Emancipation became a second goal only 2 years into the war. And that caused a lot of bitter division. It did in Tennessee among the Unionists, and it did in the North. A lot of people wondering, hey, I didn't sign up for this. I signed up for preservation of the Union. So even seeing, the experiences that they went through, seeing African Americans willing to sign up in large numbers to show that they're willing to put their lives on the line for Union, and hope that showing that by their fighting for the Union, that they would convince Northerners that they deserve the right to vote. It is a different time. The history is, it is a foreign world. And it's hard to think that transition didn't happen immediately, even that with the cataclysmic events of the American Civil War.
Yes, sir. And the agents in which you speak of, when it comes to the Klan, I've heard historians from certain organizations try to say that in the time period in which you're very much intelligent with and versed with, they would say or infer that in some ways that the Klan formed by Mr. Brown and his cohorts were to not only quell Unionist ravaging of Southern lands and Southern peoples. Is there any truth to that, sir, per the convention and what they were trying to get done?
I think you got to look at their words, their actions at the time.
Copy that, sir. 100%.
Those explanations you just said start to stem from the lost cause. If you look at what they did, if you look at how they responded, there was no, and in the statement, does it start as fraternal organization, as bonds of brotherhood between these soldiers who now they've been together for years, and that comes to an end immediately, abrupt end at the end of the Civil War? It starts out as sort of that, but it doesn't take very long that they respond to what they don't like, what they don't agree with, which is Brownlowism, stripping them of the right to vote, making a minority the majority, a permanent majority in Tennessee by stripping them of the vote. But their actions are clear, and you can twist these words. You can, of Mr. Forrest himself, who came out later and said things. You can find how it can be twisted, but even Forrest himself is in the press talking about how he wants to use the Klan to spill radical blood.
To the point where they actually called them Kluxes. They called them Kluxes in the state capitol, correct, sir?
Yeah, and if you've been Ku Klux, that was not a good thing. That was very common. The Klux, the Ku Klux, all kind of names stemming out of the Ku Klux Klan.
And real quick, the last thing I was going to ask, sir, just to discredit something that I want to know, is that there's a lot of speech about during this time that Forrest had these speeches that were given to the NCAA in the NAACP down in Memphis during these Reconstruction times. Is there any validity to that whatsoever, sir?
Nope.
Thank you, sir. As a historian, and as a person that really loves history, I really do appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
One last question, and we'll go ahead because we're getting kind of close to 8 o'clock here to the end. And this actually kind of segues well, is when did the last African-American elected representative leave the Tennessee General Assembly? You can blame your friend Charles for that one.
Thanks, Charles. Sir Charles, Mr. Ogle. I assume you mean the last one in Reconstruction?
Yes, that's yeah.
I mean, hopefully they don't strip me of my PhD right now, but I mean, there's an election. There's election of these delegates at this time, at this moment of Reconstruction, but they are, oh goodness, I'm going to say they're gone certainly by the time you get Jim Crowe really rolling throughout Tennessee and throughout the state. And you want to say sort of 1890 is sort of that moment that Jim Crowe is real, steaming down the tracks. But I want to say it's somewhere right about late 1880s. But I'm sorry. As I tell my students, don't worry, we don't do dates. Well, now I'm being asked the date and I don't have it. So we like to talk about themes and larger arguments and patterns rather than specific dates. But I think it's in the late 1880s. I'd have to look it up. Sorry.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. This has been a really robust discussion. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I would expect Mabry-Hazen House to undertake future virtual lectures in the future. This has been a successful event. If you could, please visit our website, www.mabryhazen.com/donations, and help us out there. Any sort of donations does help ensure future events like this. So With that said, everybody have a wonderful rest of your evening, and we'll see you next time on the Hill. Thank you. Bye, everyone.